enormous honor to be here to talk to you about a subject that's very dear to my heart, that is the subject of climate change, and in particular, global warming. I always like to start a little bit about framing the public discourse of this issue, because this has been an issue that's been discussed within the scientific community for quite some time, very well understood, but of course, the communication of that to diverse audiences is problematic. In fall of 2008, when the public opinion poll was done, 72% of Americans believed that there was solid evidence for global warming. In fall of 2009, only 65% of Americans believed that there was solid evidence. In the fall of spring of 2010, that dropped to 52%, and then in the fall of 2010, it was down to 58%. In Canada, it was a little better. In Canada, it's been relatively constant, that 80% of people believe that there is solid evidence, but in America, it's quite a bit lower. In the UK, similar trends have been found, that there's been a substantial decrease in the general population that actually believes there's solid evidence of global warming. Now, for a scientist, that's akin to saying, do you believe in thermometers? Because we've been measuring temperatures around the world for an awful long time. And you know, the understanding of this record is really very solid. But the reason why this is occurring, Canada, is the politicization of the issue. If you look in Canada, for example, and you break down the public opinion poll, you find that by political party, 64% of those who declare themselves as conservative voters believe that there was solid evidence. Whereas for other voters declared Liberal, New Democratic, Bloc Québécois, or Green, it was much, much higher percentages. And that difference is particularly large in the US, where 69% of Democrats believe there was solid evidence, and 41% of Republicans. Now this poses a real challenge for your organizations, for scientists in general, for those who are trying to convey the science behind this issue, because this has now entered the political realm. And unfortunately, somehow people think that if you are speaking about the issue of global warming, you are somehow a left-wing person who's advocating for some left-wing governance. So it's a challenge that we have to recognize in the communication of the science, that this has been politicized. In the US, for example, the emergence of Al Gore as a spokesperson for this has really made the issue quite partisan in the US. So what is the issue? The issue, of course, is the warming of the planet as a consequence of greenhouse gas emissions. There's ample evidence for this. There's multiple reconstructions of this that have been done, going back many hundreds of years. Here I'm just showing one from the US from the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, showing the world warming by about 0.7, 0.8 degrees over the last 120 years or so, where if you look in the record, where the top warmest years were, they're in 2010, tied with 2005, and most of the other years in the last decade are up there as well. The warming is amplified over land relative to the ocean, and we all know why. It's very simple physics, is that you know it takes more energy to raise water by 1 degree compared to land. So what are some of the impacts? Well, the impacts are profound. Some of the most dramatic ones are what's going on in the Arctic today. In 2007, a record meltback occurred, and that record was rather larger than had been projected by most climate model simulations. The trend has continued in 2011, which is shown here in the declining chart, nearly reached the 2007 record. If you actually ask the question, to what extent do we expect summer sea ice to exist in the Arctic, it's very unlikely that it'll be around in the summer towards the latter part of this century. And there's very little we will probably be able to do about that, because these are the type of changes that are in store as a consequence of our past emissions and our commitment, socioeconomic inertia towards continued commitments in the years ahead. The bottom right is what was occurring in March 2010, and very similar again this year, is that there's very little old ice left. That is, the ice has become much thinner. So not only has the area extent decreased, but the ice has become much thinner. The projections of where we're heading on the timescale of the next 100 years is rather dramatic from an atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gas point of view. Is we're presently at about 390 parts per million, and we're on target, if you take the upper bound estimates, of going way up to a level that has not been seen in many millions of years. We're already probably at a level that hasn't been seen for about 10 million years. Certainly there's direct evidence from ice cores where you can actually measure the concentration of the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in ancient air bubbles trapped in those ice cores. If you look at this, the key thing is not so much the temperature change, but the fact it's very difficult to discern any difference between those three panels in the first column. That is, in those three panels, the warming of about 0.2 degrees per decade occurs, and that's independent of the trajectory of emissions. So that's saying that whether we burn a lot of coal today or we start to use more renewables, in the next 20, 30 years we have 0.2 degrees per warming per decade, which is relatively insensitive to our emissions trajectory. On the other hand, when you look towards the end of the century, you see the type of world that we inherit, or rather we don't inherit, that our grandchildren inherit, is fundamentally different based on the emissions trajectories that we take. Now what this points to actually is the real problem, both the political challenge and the moral and ethical question involved in global warming, is that decisions we make today are not going to have an effect on the climate system within the political lifetime of those being involved in the decision making, or the business lifetime, or frankly, in some cases, the lifetime. However, the results of those decisions fundamentally will have an effect on the quality of both the cultural and social environment as well as the natural environment of the next generation. So the issue of global warming really boils down to one question, a question of intergenerational equity, which is precisely what your mandate clearly is involved in exploring, is do we, the present generation, owe anything to future generations? Do we owe them the same cultural, economic, and ecological quality of life as we presently observe? Clearly, from a World Heritage point of view, the answer would be yes.